Hey, John, you there?
Sure am.
All right. Well, we are live and we are going. So, how are you doing? I hear you're having a thunderstorm over there.
Yeah. I got the kids to bed mostly, and then a lightning storm rolled in. I think I have internet for the moment.
Well, hopefully it holds on. If not, we'll know why you got disconnected.
Right.
So, tell me, sir, what in the world got you into this audio industry? Like,
What got me into the audio industry?
or even
Okay.
further back
Oh,
from that? Like, what was your first,
it's been a while.
yeah, what was your first experience that really struck you in terms of audio? Like, were you a kid and you heard some song and you thought, wow, that's amazing? Or, what kind of enticed you in terms of audio?
I'm not sure what really caught my attention at first. I know I had a bunch of terrible headsets and terrible earbuds, and back then they were called earbuds, not IEMs like they are today. Um, these were the freebies that you get actually at Walmart, $5 or $10 back in the late '90s.
Sure.
That was my initial experience with headphones. Audio quality was pretty bad. A lot of background hiss. Frequency response was abysmal. And I just had this idea that, oh, this could certainly be better. And so in the late '90s and early 2000s, I'm looking around the internet of what it was at the time. I figure out what can I do to get my audio to not have a hiss in the background, and how can I make this better? I found Sennheiser headphones and quickly decided Sennheiser was the way to go at the time, and ended up with a pair of HD 280 Pros.
I know those well.
And I enjoyed them. The quality was substantially better. They really lacked bass, at least my set did. The sealed set just didn't satisfy me. And that really kicked off JDS Labs because that pursuit of trying to have a better headphone experience ultimately led me to build a Seymour headphone amplifier with bass boost, and that's how we got started.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely remember that amp, and I remember I was thinking about building one myself. And ironically, that's why I ended up buying your JDS C5, is because I was like, yeah, no, I'm lazy. So I looked around and thought, I could buy a Seymour amp, but then I saw the C5 and I thought, well, that looks pretty nice. And I kind of researched it and everything, and lo and behold, there it is. So lucky for me, you ended up on this pursuit of audio bliss. So you weren't happy with the Apple stock earbuds? Is that what you're telling me?
I didn't even have Apple earbuds. I couldn't afford those. I had like Sony earbuds I acquired from who knows where. Still have them, by the way. They're stuffed away in a drawer, and they sounded very bad. They were just not good headphones at all.
I had a pair of, I don't know if you've ever seen they're like a small gray band in the Sony earbuds. They're
Oh
from
yeah,
from the I had a pair of those. I think they were the V600 or something like that. And I would always push them in my ear and put pressure on them to get the extra bass, cuz just wearing
I did
them,
too.
yeah,
I
just
had
wearing
this.
them
I had
normal,
that
it's like
set.
this isn't
That was
working.
fun.
Yeah. But I mean, I probably listened to those, gosh, thousands of hours. Oh, I suffered so greatly. My first real pair of earphones, real, was the Sony MDR EX85 LP, which by today's standards, in terms of IMs, is not reference quality by any means, but it was the first headphone or earphone I had ever heard that actually had sufficient bass. And ironically, now it's way too much bass. But back then I was like, "There's bass. This is awesome." So I listened to those, and it was just like game changing. That's probably the set that really got me thinking, wow, there are nice IEMs. Like, what else is out there? And I started looking at frequency graphs and kind of getting into the whole quality IEM segment. And I kind of went through a lot of Sony's, actually. I have to give them credit for their price to performance ratio. They had a lot of sub $100 earphones that were pretty good, nothing amazing, but they kind of whet my appetite and got me into the hobby. But so that's pretty cool. Now, is your family into audio at all? Is it just you?
I wouldn't say like into audio. My dad was one who constantly had music playing in his office. He ran a business for a number of years, and I remember when I was a kid going in and listening to '90s grunge and whatever was on the radio at the time. Um, my mom, not really. Siblings, not really. No,
Any
that's just me.
musicians in your family, or do you play anything?
My mother played piano.
Oh, nice.
I played alto sax in high school and haven't really touched it since. But I enjoyed it while I did.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've never played the sax because I could never make it make a sound. I just sound like a dying duck, so I just kind of gave up.
it's tough. I don't think my bass was built to play the saxophone. It was really hard. Like I did well. I joined the jazz ensemble and section leader and all that, whatever they called it. But even after years of practice and trying to master the thing, I did not have the physical capability to make the sounds I wanted to make. I
Sure.
remember ending with this professional saxophone player, and he was like, "Oh yeah, just like do this, and it'll make this sound like on Saturday Night Live." And I was like, "That is impossible. I tried it, and it doesn't work." So,
Yeah, I'm more of a key. Anything with keys on it, I can play. Keyboards, even like things like harps and stuff like that. I'm not a harp player. Don't misunderstand me. But like, I have the ability to kind of like know where the notes are and make melodies and stuff like that. So that's kind of
yeah,
my thing.
yeah,
But when any wind instruments, things with reeds, forget it. Like just I can't do that.
I hear you. Yeah, I have a lot of fun just poking around on keyboard of any kind.
So now, how did you get into like electronics and engineering and that kind of stuff? Was that a hobby at a young age, or did you get then like schooling or?
Oh, how did that happen? I was trying to get away from a girlfriend. I was like, you know what? You're gonna go to school. I'm gonna go to engineering school. We're gonna go to different schools. And then it was chance that I somehow landed upon electrical engineering. I was completely indecisive in engineering school. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was just there to get a degree. And at some point, I checked a box and I'm an electrical engineer.
Awesome. Honestly, I almost went that route myself. Um, I was in high school in New Hampshire, and I went to they had this running start program for college where you could get some college credits, and I took electronics course, and then I took the advanced electronics course, and then my friend and I entered the like New England electronics competition, and we actually placed pretty well. Um, and I was like, "This is great, I love this." And then I got into the computer side of it, and just like just beelined it into computers. So I never kind of, but that's why I still work with, you know, basic electronics. Like I have a general knowledge of it, but obviously nowhere near your level of engineering skill. But I love the I don't know. There's just always been something awesome about these small components that do such a small individual thing, and yet altogether they build these complex circuits that can do, generate the audio we hear. I think that's fascinating, personally.
Yeah, there really is a fascinating side of old school analog electronics. So much of the development these days is into the software domain and digital and all that. But I really value high skilled analog circuit development, which people may come as to think, oh yeah, op amp based amplifiers aren't true discrete designs, but um, there's still quite a bit of art involved in creating any analog circuit.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, I think it's interesting too because in the audiophile world, there's a lot of people that are, you know, super fans of analog equipment. Like
Yeah.
for instance, right now
Oops.
vinyl is huge, and
Right, right.
not exactly parallel, but just the idea that something non-discrete electronics is sought after by so many people is pretty interesting. I'm personally a digital fan myself, but I love analog instruments. So, for instance, I have a Fender Rhodes behind me. This is like the best thing ever made, and it's all analog and mechanical parts. There's no digital electronics, no power. The thing's freaking awesome. So I like stuff like that. But when it comes to audio reproduction, I'm definitely a fan of the digital domain personally, which we'll get into that in a little bit. Um, so you had mentioned that you wanted to build an amplifier to kind of satiate your desire for extra bass or less hiss or whatever. So how did that really? When did you really feel like you were starting to know that you were going to make a company out of this?
Well, it's pretty apparent that there was some real demand by the time I built the first one. I had extra parts. I built the first Seymour with bass boost. And you don't buy 2 resistors or 4 resistors. You buy 100 resistors or 1,000. They're just there's a bag of them. Take it. Um, I
Massive.
built a few more, put them on eBay, and by surprise, people yeah, can you build more? I want one too. So this was sophomore or junior year of college, and I didn't have time for that business sort of thing. I'm
Sure.
supposed to be taking tests and coursework and not running off making circuits and building a business. But what I did was an auction on eBay to see, okay, how much will this sell for? And that wasn't really the goal, but if I only had time to list 1 or 2 amplifiers a week, I would list them, and it would sell for 2 or 3 times what I ever thought was possible. So for the first few years of what's going to become JDS Labs, a company, it wasn't taken seriously. I was simply selling kits and selling amplifiers because I enjoyed it, frankly, and it was a hobby. Hobby. It took another 3 or 4 years for decided, okay, I'm actually going to turn this into a company. And that was a whole separate experience I can get into, but yeah, looking back, it's like 4 years. Well, if you knew there was demand, man, it seems like maybe I should have run a little faster in hindsight, but here I am.
Yeah, it's always a balance though. Life, you got to have school, family, friends, work, or you don't. You
Yeah.
just have all work, but then you have no life. But that is interesting. So, what year was that you felt like how long ago was this? Like when was this starting out?
So the first few amplifiers I built were in 2007,
Okay.
and the Objective 2 appeared in 2011. That was the point I decided, okay, there's so much demand, so many people are asking me to help because I'm just, a hobby guy in the industry. It was an overwhelming amount of time that was going into what I call the hobby. I quit my full-time job and focused on satisfying all the requests I was receiving inbox. It hasn't stopped.
It's crazy, because even this, I don't remember when you made the C5. That was probably, I'm gonna assume, in the mid 2010s, like 2015 maybe 2013. When was that roughly? Do you know?
Yeah. Well, I honestly lost track of that one. So the C5 was in development around the time Objective 2 appeared on the scene. I think it came a little bit after Objective 2, so it was either 2011 or 2012.
Yeah, so that's because I think I got it pretty close to when it came out. Let's take a second, if you can, and that Objective 2 is a really interesting thing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole point of that project was to prove that basically you could make an inexpensive amplifier that exceeded all the threshold of audiophile, specifications, right? Now, how did that influence your designs? Because, not to jump ahead too far, but I believe the Element line was kind of wasn't that stemmed from that, sort of? Or at least inspired by that? Because you still make an objective amplifier, right?
We've retired the Objective 2. We still
Okay.
offer the kits.
But for a while, you manufactured your version of the objective amplifier, right? Which is identical, other than, if I'm not mistaken, you just tweaked a few things which we had mentioned, NWAV guy. So he had that amplifier design, and he kind of fell off the scene, fell off the planet, really. And you had basically had to determine if you could, modify some aspects of it. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, not quite. We adhered strictly as possible to the derivatives license called.
Yep.
He disappeared in 2012, if I remember correctly, and by that point, the Objective DAC had been coordinated with Yoyodyne Consulting, and there were a number of different startups, we'll call it, who were representing the open source Objective 2 and ODAC projects. I cannot remember the exact names of those companies. It's not terribly important now, but I'll say that they're all gone except for 2, JDS Labs and Mayflower Electronics. Mayflower was actually a customer of ours, and that's a whole separate thing. He's an interesting guy, and I'm amazed to see how far he's gotten. He's done well. Check out Mayflower. He's gotten into the gaming side of the market, and we've stayed away from that thus far. But essentially, The Objective 2, to answer your question, no, we did not modify it. We never
Okay.
modified it. We always sold the Objective 2 with the original bill of materials installed on the circuit boards. They were always perfectly in compliance with what's supposed to be built, and that was the reason that it succeeded as a project, because there were no changes to it.
Okay. Now, for anyone that doesn't know, NWAV Guy was a huge proponent of objective measurements, and basically that, correct me if I'm wrong, but he felt a lot of the audiophile marketing kind of talk was, essentially nonsense, and that if it measured well, it would sound great. He's actually the reason I bought my Sansa Fuse. For anyone that knows that, it was a little Sansa Fuse player. Don't tell me you have one over there.
I think I do. Right by it, somewhere in here. That's a clip. Have you seen this?
I have the clip as well. So I don't have the clip. I have the
that's what
zip clip, I think it is, which also measured identical to the clip. So I had those two, which I still think are amazing MP3 players for the size, and my Fuse still holds battery life well, and you can modify it with Rockbox and get all these cool themes on it, which I've actually designed some themes myself. But anyhow, yeah, he was a huge proponent of that. So if you don't know him, but he kind of fell off the planet. I don't know if you've ever heard of what happened to him. I always wondered if he was alive, if he got a job offer somewhere and they just paid him to not talk about something or what. But I just hope the guy's okay.
Yeah, no, I've been asked that question a number of times. No, I know nothing that anyone else is aware of. So the guy appeared. He developed a following, we'll call it, within the audio community. That resulted in a ton of success of the objective scene, we'll call it, where you're building high-performance headphone amplifiers that actually should be what's called transparent. Put that in quotes because people got this ongoing debate of what is transparent, what is subjective, and what is objective, and those are long discussions and camps on both sides. Some people just absolutely refute the objective scene, and it goes both ways. Like, who knows?
Absolutely. And that interests me greatly. I'm not at all for or against either side completely. I'm definitely probably more objective for the people who know me. Like if I had an amp that I thought met the specifications that I considered sufficient, I don't care who makes it or what it costs. Give it to me for $5. I'm happy. But I also do believe that sometimes our brains are incredibly deceptive. There's a lot of psychology that goes into the human brain, and it's easy to fool our brains. So I think part of the problem with proving something's objectively, let's say perfect, whatever, is that there's really no easy way to test that. And, there's double-blind testing, and there's all these different forms of testing. But, I mean, to get a sufficient sample size and the sufficient setup, and it's just, I don't know if there's been enough work to really prove anything. Obviously, if like Harman, for instance, a lot of the earphones and headphones we review, we being like, YouTube people, you'll hear the Harman target thrown around a lot, and Sean Olive and things like that. And, when you actually look at the study behind that, it's really a lot more subjective than you might think at first. Because you're like,
all personal preference.
The Harman target, and it's like, yeah, but it's a subjective target. So anyhow, but that's something that always fascinates me. I like the just the thought of, looking into those traits of audio, the specifications, the total harmonic distortion, the synad, and, all that kind of stuff, jitter, and, like what is the point at which those things are audible? And,
and that was the whole idea. And anybody who's new to audio these days has no sense of how this played out over a decade ago. Objective 2 was from 2011. It's been a long time, and we're still focusing on measurements and trying to shoot for high performance. I publicly stated a couple of years ago that this race, one we're interested in being part of anymore, because we've hit such extreme levels of performance. It's like, okay, well, we're at 119 dB synad, and the noise floor is microvolts, and you really aren't going to hear much better than this. We're focusing on other aspects right now, but I agree.
Sure, and I think I absolutely loved it, if you want to transition to your Element line. So I have the original Element, and I don't know if anyone can see this on the camera, but this thing is freaking awesome. They engraved it with it's like a space, and that's the moon. So my rotator knob is a moon. So I thought that was pretty badass. But this thing is great. Now, it's not perfect, but not due to the sound quality, but just, I think we've worked on this in the past, but Windows and ASIO drivers are just, yeah, so these, I think this one just, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first generation never had like a certified driver for ASIO that kind of came out and was guaranteed to work with Windows or something along those lines. I was actually trying to use ASIO for All. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
And I had a really bad experience with that. I was actually listening. I used the application MusicBee, and I had set it to use the ASIO for All to the USB on the Element, and just halfway through a song, it was like a blast of noise, and I was just like, all right, forget that. Which I do not. There's no fault on the DAC, because I knew, talking with you, that was not a supported thing. It's not guaranteed or anything. But what's awesome about the Element 2 and 3 is, if I'm correct, they do have proper ASIO drivers, right?
Correct. Yeah, the first generation from 2015 was based on an audio chip, which was limited to USB Class 1 or 2496K. And the driver support from that company it left quite a bit to be desired. So in the second generation, we went to the XMOS engine, which is the best. We've continued with that and continued to develop in the third generation.
And for anyone that's not familiar with what we're talking about, ASIO is asynchronous input-output. It's basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but it's kind of a more direct channel between what you're listening from, your source app, and the device, right? So you're kind of getting theoretically closer to a bit-perfect audio signal rather than any kind of DSP or anything that's affecting your system, kind of altering your sound. And just to be clear, the Element 1 is great with Windows and Mac using just the default, functionality. But Windows has some interesting issues just itself with its DSD or whatever the audio thing is in Windows, with some sample rate conversion or something like that. I don't know. It causes some weird bass issues in my experience. But the Element is awesome on the Mac. Are you familiar? Do you use Macs, John, I assume?
Yeah, I'm on a Mac right now.
Okay. When you're designing your products, this is just something I was kind of curious about myself. How is it different when you're designing it to work with Windows versus when you're designing it to work with Core Audio on the Mac? Because Core Audio seems to be a lot more plug and play, things just work. But from the development side of it, or from your side of it, is that harder or easier to design for Mac versus Windows?
There's no difference from my perspective. I mean, we're using off-the-shelf XMOS USB Audio Class 2 firmware engine. So, off the shelf isn't entirely true. Started off the shelf. We've modified it extensively and brought it up to date, and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of engineering time into writing the firmware. But the point is, we're writing for the USB Audio Class 1 or the USB Audio Class 2. Those are standards.
Sure.
Which the operating system then provides drivers for, or you provide your own drivers, which are licensed through Thesicon for the ASIO support.
Okay, it makes sense. Makes sense.
So no difference between the three major operating systems.
Awesome. So in the Element 3, I've noticed something that I've been wanting for a very long time. You've implemented a slight DSP functionality there. I've noticed that you've added a 2-band EQ. Is that correct? A bass and treble EQ?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a slight DSP. I mean, this is a serious digital signal processor.
I just mean it doesn't have like it's not a 32-band EQ with parametric Q values. It's like it's a simple EQ in a high quality DSP.
Yeah. No, it's only limited by the available processing power on that 8-core processor. DSP want to do it in real time and any reasonable level of quality consumes quite a bit of processing power, at least for these 400 megahertz cores. So essentially, you can run one filter live per core of the XMOS processor, which meant that we only had 2 cores available, and thus we got 2 bands of DSP.
And I assume that's strictly a cost limitation. Probably you want to keep it at a target price point.
Oh no, No. So we had already built the Element 3. We'd already designed it. It had already been released. This was a firmware update.
Oh.
We made the DSP
Oh.
support available. All we were saying is, hey, try this new firmware. We enabled DSP on an existing project.
That's
So
awesome.
it
So
was
bonus.
something I'd wanted to do for years, and it took quite a while to get to that support simply because we didn't have the user interface to pull it off. And Element
Right.
3 enabled that. You had to have some kind of screen, a way to interact with the screen to make it, in my opinion, make sense. I want
Sure.
it to be parametric.
And I haven't used it myself, but it looks pretty simple. I assume you click the knob and then spin to just select menu items and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. So super simple, super awesome. Now I noticed in the specs that it has some kind of a harmonic setting. Is that adding harmonic distortion?
If you'd like, sure.
Really? Okay. Does that kind of simulate like a tube amp? I mean, what's the goal there?
Honestly, that area was called, let's see, harmonic compensation, or total harmonic. I think they refer to it as just harmonic compensation. At any rate, that was there for engineering development purposes. While we're tuning the analog output stage in the IV converter, uh, ESS Saber series performs best if you tune or compensate for the second and third harmonics in the audio signal based on the parameters that you find in the IV stage. So basically, you're going to have an elevated second harmonic and often an elevated third harmonic. If you apply compensation to try to cancel out those second and third harmonics, you achieve a higher level of performance. So,
Interesting.
since we had to do that, let me back and see. The old method was code what you think is the right answer in firmware, compile the code, upload the code, hook up the analyzer and test, and then repeat. That was a very painful process to arrive at right levels of compensation. In Element 3, the firmware developers, why not just put this in the menu and then I can scroll through the knob and do this live while I'm staring at the audio analyzer? He's like, yeah, sure. And it was so much easier. Instead of coding and compiling and all that, it was just turn the knob, and now I can see the second harmonic is gone. So I'm pleased.
Awesome.
Figured, well, we'll just leave that in there.
Sure. It'd be interesting to hear it. So going back to total harmonic distortion, THD, I know a lot of that is debated, I guess, whether it's subjective or objective. I hear people say that, if you have THD more than 1% at a kilohertz, that's audible. And I see some people say, like, you're never going to hear it. Like, what are your thoughts on THD? Do you think that is there a metric that you think is the threshold of audibility? Like, do you guys sit
I've
there and
never.
turn up a
I hear what you're
THD?
saying. Supposedly, this goes back to NWAV guy. The threshold was about 0.005%, and it's still even difficult to differentiate between that level and just a light amount more. So it's debatable how much distortion is actually audible or possible to perceive. I am highly skeptical that anybody can hear much beyond about 90 dB. I'd add it that way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that a lot of the supposed golden ear listeners, myself included, when put up against a double-blind test, would see that, oh, well, I can't actually. I thought I could, but I really can't. In fact, what I've done, and this isn't just like talk. Like, actually, you might remember this. This is an extra C5 case that you gave me, and I built an A/B switcher in this with two 3.5 millimeter inputs. It's completely passive, and I use this thing exclusively. And I got a switch on here. I just flick it back and forth, and I can like. So what I do is, it's not a true double-blind test, but just for myself, what I'll do a lot of times is I'll plug in two sources or something, and I'll purposely flip it a billion times so I don't know which is which, and I'll volume match them and everything, and then I'll go and I'll try to listen to see if I can determine, is there any difference between these. And honestly, when they're volume matched, I don't know if I've ever heard a source that's bad unless it was obviously bad, like a noticeable level of hiss, or like I have an old CD player that I have here. This is a Sony Discman car, and this thing like drops off in the bass below 100 hertz, and that's audible. But other than a few rare exceptions like that, I think most sources are pretty good. I'm not claiming you're not going to hear anything with certain headphones in certain situations, but just in general, I think the source quality in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years has just gotten astronomically good. In fact, the Apple dongle blows my mind. Like, I tell people all the time, unless you have very powerful headphones that are very inefficient, all you really need is an Apple dongle, and that thing is phenomenal. I mean, you're getting really good specs. Again, it doesn't provide a lot of power, and there's also some issues with it on Android, which you have to be aware of. But just the fact that they're able to pump out the quality that they do with that little thing is mind-boggling. Now, you're gonna power a Stax 009 with it? No, but for a small iPhone device, plugging that in, you're gonna get like really good audio. So that's really cool. Now, with all this advent of these small USB DACs and things like that, did that influence the discontinuation of your C5 at all? Was that part of that? Like why did you? It seems like the C5 was such an awesome little amplifier. It had like the EQ in it and the double gain stage and small form factor, long battery life. I mean, what was the reason that pushed you, away from that? Was it just sales were diminishing, or I mean, were you just trying to free up time for new projects, or?
It was really simple and easy. You look at the demand of a product over time, and naturally things make sense to produce, and you have a decline in demand over time, and it's time to retire the product and move on. And that's just where the C5 was. But the reason the C5's demand declined was actually quite simple. The advent of iPhone. Took a few years, but keep in mind, this was where audio was around the time the C5 was in production. This was a hard disk based iPod.
Yep.
And it had a high noise floor. The output was 1 volt. And those two factors meant it made a lot of sense to put a headphone amplifier paired up with it with a set of rubber bands. And a few years later, we've got these iPhones. Why would you ever want to tote around an iPod?
Sure.
Wouldn't. You just play on your smartphone. You don't want to attach an amplifier to your smartphone. Naturally, demand for these portable amplifiers declined, and it wasn't just JDS Labs. It was everybody. I remember, I don't want to give away names, but there was a company who was selling tons and tons of portable amplifiers, and talking with him a few years after this all went down, he's like, yeah, we almost went out of business, so that's why we had to pivot and start making headphones. The portable headphone amplifier industry basically collapsed.
Yeah. Well, I must be the exception because I still carry around an MP3 player.
Oh yeah, well,
but the reason primarily, though, honestly, is not really that I like my Samsung. I still have a Note 9. I'm going to age myself here. It's a great phone. It has a very well measuring headphone output, so I'm happy listening to music from it. But this has a terabyte of storage. So for me, having the dedicated battery and storage, and I love physical controls. Like, I do a lot of things. Like, if I'm driving, I can reach over and push a button on this. I don't have to look at my screen. I don't have to scroll through songs. I can just... So I like those few things are really good selling points for an MP3 player. But I realize it's not for everybody. And, this phone actually does have an SD card slot in it. So, you could technically throw a terabyte card in here probably and have all your music on your phone. But then, you're draining your battery life and you're getting notifications and blah, 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 blah. It's like an experience thing. For me personally, but phone technology has gotten amazing. I mean, in fact, the amplifiers and the DACs in them are incredibly good. I remember back in the day they used to argue over the Cirrus DAC versus the Wolfson DAC or whatever, and I mean it's at the point now where I don't think you're going to hear, an iPhone from an iPhone is going to sound the same because they're probably all going to have really high-end DACs, or I guess now it's the Apple dongle because you don't have a headphone port anymore. But they're all going to sound the same, I guess, because you're going to have to use a dongle.
That and there's also the distinction to be made between general consumer, like wife, wants Apple's wireless, we call it AirPods.
AirPods, yep.
And then people that we collaborate with, which are listening to Sennheiser headphones or $1,000 earbuds. Yeah.
Shout out to the 650 and 600 right here.
Yeah. But there's two different segments of people here. You've got people who care about audio and headphones, and you've got people who don't. The vast majority of people listening to music on an iPhone, not audiophiles.
Absolutely.
But getting back to what you're saying, there are certainly people still carrying around apps or digital audio players, they call them these days. That MP3 player is really a term people use, is it?
I don't really know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't play MP3s on it, so it's not really an MP3 player. It's a
There's still
ALAC.
MP3s here, but
Mine's an ALAC player.
yeah. Oh, I just don't see the market for apps same way I saw it 10 years ago. It's
Sure.
completely different.
And I don't know why, but companies like Sony, I feel like they're shooting themselves in the foot, because this is the A105, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, this retails for $300, $350, something like that. At least the current version is. And, they have another model that's like $1,200. Like, I realize there are probably some niche audiophiles that will purchase that, but I mean, I feel like they're targeting like these wide extremes. They have this like budget player and then these super ridiculous players. There's not a lot in between. Like, there's no like $400 player that supports 2 terabytes of music with like, really good audio volume output. Because I think this is like 35 milliwatts per channel, which is plenty. I mean, that'll power my HT600 for me personally. But I know people that I know that would not be happy with the volume on a set like this coming out of that. But I don't generally listen to music very loud, so for me it works fine. But yeah, I think unfortunately a lot of the changes over the years has been for convenience, because for instance, and my wife probably could care less if I throw her under the bus here. I love my wife. She sings, she's into music, she loves listening to music, she loves vocal harmonies and all this stuff, but like you could play on a boombox, or you could play it on my Infinity surround sound 5.1 system with Super Audio CD, and she doesn't hear a difference. She's like, it sounds the same to me, and I'm like, okay. Like, I wouldn't even listen to the other thing, let alone like tell someone to listen to it. But like, for her, it's just the music, it's the experience, it's hearing the song and the vocals and the harmonies. For me, the majority of the listening experience and enjoyment is the sonic quality of it. The smoothness, the clarity, the separation, the realistic soundstage, the impression that I'm listening to something in the studio with someone. Just, there's all those sonic qualities that is more about that for me than it is listening to the vocals or listening to the melody. Not that those don't matter, of course they do, but so it's really interesting to see the two different extremes there, just right between my wife and I. So I think that over time, when it comes to convenience, when you have someone on her end of the spectrum, they'd much rather have AirPods, because why would I want to deal with wires, and why would I want to do this and that? Whereas for me, it's like, well, nothing against AirPods, I actually have a pair. But, sonically, they're just not the best frequency response. They're not the best this, and they rely on Bluetooth, and you have to charge the battery, and blah, 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 blah. So I think those two extremes kind of are fighting each other, and unfortunately, I think the majority of people lean towards that other extreme. And I think that's kind of shifting the trends towards wireless and affordability and mass production. And so, speaking of that, like, what are your thoughts on wireless? Because I mean, I think you'd agree that there's a big push to make everything wireless in the last few years. I mean, Apple's released their wireless over-ear headphones. They have their AirPods. Samsung has the Buds, and every company's coming out with some kind of true wireless. Moondrop has their 5 versions. They're coming out with Bluetooth transmitters, and your phone's all Bluetooth. They don't have headphone jacks anymore. I mean, everything seems like it's kind of getting pushed that way. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Well, it's a natural state of progress. That's what it is. We keep moving forward. It's a consumer mindset here in America. Is it beneficial? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my wife has the AirPods. I know the guy here in the office enjoys EMF headphones, also has AirPods. That's what he uses when he leaves the office. It's the right thing to do for making music accessible and easy to enjoy.
Absolutely.
There's value in that. So yeah, that's totally fine. You're still going to have high-end headphones. Because you have AirPods doesn't mean you can't have nicer experience when you sit down at home. And there's always going to be audiophiles. There's always going to be people doing minor levels of hobby.
Sure. Absolutely. I have the AirPods exactly for that reason. They serve a purpose. When I'm at work and I'm messing with computers and moving things around, I don't want to be tangling my wires, and I don't want to be looking like I'm wearing this big, thing. So I have the little AirPods in my ears, and I have the ambient mode turned on so I can hear people talking, and that functionality is awesome for that environment. Now, would I ever use them at home? Personally, no. And then nothing against AirPods whatsoever. They do sound very good, but like I'd always rather have my Sennheiser or my Kato Moondrop Kato earphones because they just sound better to me. And for me, I'd rather at home, when I have accessibility to those things, I'd much rather enjoy the sonic bliss of those versus the convenience of the AirPods. So they absolutely, they serve a purpose, and I even highly recommend them for people who are going to use them in a situation like I just said at work. That's awesome. Now, they also have some of the most phenomenal noise cancellation I've ever heard. Like, I go on an airplane, I turn on noise cancellation, and it's like, how is this freaking possible? So that's a huge benefit of those. Although if you're like me, I also have Etymotic earphones, and those are like 35 decibel earplugs. You just whoop, and then you can't hear anything. But definitely not convenient for talking to people. So there's a huge difference there too. So speaking of the wireless, oh sorry, go ahead. Were you gonna say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say go ahead myself. You go.
Okay. I guess one thing that we had talked about before that interests both of us is kind of what do you see as like the future of hi-fi? Like, how do you see things progressing in the future? Obviously, there's wireless, but more than that, like, what do you think the landscape is going to look like, 10, 20, 30 years from now?
I did, Jess, that was a thing I've been thinking about. And if I've been pondering, I mean literally pondering, asking myself these questions, and I don't have all the answers, but here's what I've seen unfold in my 17 years hi-fi audio industry. I went from relatively decent digital performance where we had a high background noise floor, okay? We had limited voltage swings, so we could not drive high impedance headphones. And a lot of headphones 15 to 20 years ago were, if they were high end, needed a considerable amount of amplification. Years go by, digital audio players get better, headphones appear. Then throughout the next decade, JDS Labs and others really pushed for objective performance, basically eliminating the need to pursue extremely costly amplifiers from earlier part of the decade. Now that we've gotten through this objective phase, I'm going to call it, of the past 10 plus years, I don't think there's really much left to be done on the analog side of development in the audio industry. Like it's great. You've got fantastic audio. Most of your digital audio players are remarkably good. Voltage output is now plentiful for the majority of cases. Like I think Mac doing like 3 volts RMS out on most of their systems.
Crazy.
Yeah, which is 3 times more powerful than they used to be. That'll drive a Sennheiser headphone pretty respectively. Not to say Sennheiser is the me of hi-fi audio, but the point is, where are we going forward is probably into the stratosphere in terms of hi-fi element, because topped out and you've got a $99 or $109 JDS Labs Atom amp more or less perfects what can be achieved in terms of analog audio. Yeah. Where do you go from here in terms of performance? Well, there is zero incentive to push performance any higher. And I've told people this. There is no reason that you need more power. There's no reason that you need a lower noise floor. It's done. Nevertheless, we've got people still trying to sign at even higher than a low 120s. And I'm like, why? Just don't need to do that.
So real quick,
But
so Synad, for most people, I assume audiophiles might be familiar with that term, but can you go into that a little bit? It's like signal and distortion or something like that. What does it stand for again? I think it's signal, noise, and distortion.
Essentially, yeah. I think about it more as the reciprocal of total harmonic distortion. It's basically looking at both the noise floor and the distortion components and a discrete number here. The higher the number, the better. That's not exactly true because that threshold of transparency that we talked about, where if you're beyond that point, it doesn't matter. But yeah, SINAD basically means let's look at the noise floor and let's look at the distortion components and arrive at a figure. That can then be used to evaluate performance of an audio system.
Sure.
Where are we going from here? I'm very curious. This could be split up into a number of discussions, but talking about hi-fi strictly, like in terms of audiophile headphones, I see high-end audio stagnating in terms of analog side. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the digital side. I'm sure that Bluetooth continue to evolve. Heard rumors that we'll get to lossless wireless audio streaming, which is possible. One of the hobbies that I dove into a few years ago, and so much lately, but everybody's familiar with phones, you'll understand that DJI created a streaming technology that basically allows you to stream HD video and audio potentially real time, like with 30 milliseconds of latency.
Wow.
If they can do it with video, it can be done with audio, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Matter of time.
Yeah, video is much larger generally.
Oh yeah. The thing though to understand with that technology is that it still requires a ton of computational power to achieve. Though the people spending money on this video streaming technology with low latency, spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and it runs super hot and takes a ton of power. They can only get away with it because they're flying drones where it's naturally cooled. You've got 4 motors spinning, keeping the processor from exploding. If you put it on a desk, it overheats in 30 seconds.
Not very consumer friendly.
Oh, but the point is, let's give it years or so, and we could potentially arrive at a full computational power and technology where we have low latency, lossless streaming audio.
Sure.
It's going to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the computers we had 30 years ago that took up this whole room, and now they're in your hand. So, I mean, it's only a matter of time before the computational power is exponentially better, and the efficiency is better, and the batteries are better. And, like, I've seen a trend personally that a lot of the audiophile DAPs are starting to have better quality Bluetooth codecs. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the whole intent of Bluetooth originally, was a low-power wireless transmission, because you have Wi-Fi, but that's not low power. So Bluetooth was kind of designed to be a little bit more power efficient. And when it originally was designed, I don't think it was intended for audio specifically. It was more for like accessories and things like that. And then people started using it for audio, and so then you have the different audio codecs, LDAC, and Sony works on a lot of those. Are you familiar with the different codecs for Bluetooth by chance? Like, what are the because I know the bit rates for the Sony, is it Sony LDAC, I believe? They claim to be pretty high. Is there any new Bluetooth technology you're aware of? I know the new iPhones come with like Bluetooth 5.2 or whatever the new version is. Like, has there been any advancement in the Bluetooth realm? And is that anything that you're looking at in your new, models of equipment that you're making? Like, are you going to be adding any kind of Bluetooth functionality, or are you sticking with the analog route for, headphones?
We actually did put Bluetooth 5 into the EL-DAC 2 last year.
Oh, okay.
How many people know about that? It's an option. It's pretty well hidden. You have to go in the drop down and click Add Bluetooth. You have to actually put the module into the product. And the reason we did not make that the default and stronger was because it's more and more of an experiment just to see like how much demand is out there. Made it an option for the product. You will see Bluetooth all over the place in a lot of the Chinese offerings right now.
Yeah.
Don't think any domestic amplifier and Mac builders are really focusing on that. There are a handful that have had Bluetooth for years, like back to Bluetooth 4 and earlier. But, I really haven't seen a lot of, call it, groundbreaking development in terms of Bluetooth in the past year. It was moving super quick between let's say the past 5 to 8 years ago. And it was like by the time we would prototype a Bluetooth board or like that had Bluetooth, the next generation was out, and we thought, okay, we're going to slow down on this because we didn't want to release a product that was already outdated. Anyway, Bluetooth 5 stabilized in my opinion. We've had that product out for a year, and I don't really think much has changed for Bluetooth since we did it. It has DeX HD support. LDAC was considered. Those are two competing standards, and there are ways to get it to one product. It really comes down to finding the right Bluetooth partner and licensing. The quality of aptX HD and LDAC is actually quite good. Seeing more interest lately from new faces in the market that like to listen to Bluetooth, which is interesting because just a few years ago, no one in our segment of the market really cared about Bluetooth. It was a nice to have, but don't really want to use it kind of feature. Now it's becoming, oh, I actually might use that. So there's a shift going on.
Real quick, John, I don't know if anyone else on the chat's noticed this, and maybe I just haven't been aware of it, but your mic seems like it's dropping out a little bit when you start to talk. I don't know if that, maybe you want to lower that sensitivity down again. Maybe the storm is breaking up.
Yeah, let's give that a try. 1 second here.
Because I don't hear much storm noise, so that's probably preferable to lower that or raise it or whatever.
Idea.
Yeah, I'm a huge Bluetooth proponent when it's required, like with the AirPods and work and whatever. But otherwise, I have an auxiliary cable in my car that I leave in my car because personally, I can hear the Bluetooth in the high treble especially. And I've noticed we had two cars recently. We had a Toyota Yaris that had the built-in Bluetooth from the factory, which is a 2014 model, and I have a Sony NEXT 3000B or something like that audio unit in my Camry that I put in myself, and the Bluetooth is noticeably different. On the Yaris, the hi-hats and cymbals are just like digitally just horrid. And again, that's one of the things, like, my wife would listen to it and say, I don't hear anything. And I'd be like, how do you listen to this? And then I go in the Camry, and while it's not like, hi-fi audio per se, it's completely listenable. Like, I don't ever notice it. It's not like, ooh, that sounds objectionable. So there's definitely a difference there in the implementation of the Bluetooth in those two models. And probably, I assume the Sony has a much newer Bluetooth that supports, aptX or whatever. So that's definitely a factor. Now, do you ever listen to like Sonos? Have you heard any of those wireless speakers? Anything like that?
Yeah. My wife has one that she totes around to the garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's wireless and battery powered and all that. We've got, I think, a couple Sonos in the house. The kids love them. Yeah.
Because one of the benefits that I've heard, and I have a few JBL speakers, and they're hit or miss, but a lot of the JBL stuff actually does a pretty good job in terms of DSP. And that seems to be the huge trend that I think is probably one of the major benefits of Bluetooth, is that devices designed for Bluetooth often have DSP built into them so that they kind of tweak the frequency response or tweak the sound in a way that to most people would be like enhanced or better. Now, as an audiophile, you may or may not like that depending on what it sounds like, but that's kind of a neat side effect of having that, is because it's all digital and it's self-contained. A lot of times JBL specifically tweaks the frequency response, and you can see this because I actually had a JBL Clip. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one. It's a little speaker. Mm-hmm. And when the speaker was having a problem, I actually pulled the speaker out and I made my own little amplifier and I hooked it up, and it did not sound the same because they had a lot of DSP tweaking the frequency response. So it's probably a way for them to manufacture an inexpensive speaker and have it sound good by just kind of adding some bass and lowering some treble, whatever. But what are your thoughts on sound purity in terms of DSP? Obviously, you have DSP in the Element, but it's not a requirement. It's optional, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
right. Yeah, it's turned off by default.
The Sennheiser HD series, for instance, like they have a pretty noticeable sub-bass dip. Like there's not a lot of low, like deep bass in them. They sound good, but so that Element 3 is really enticing to me because I feel like you could probably take that 40 hertz EQ point and go boop, and these things would probably sound a little bit fuller at the low end.
Sean, let me tell you, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. Yeah.
So I mean, you may have just sold me one of those. That's awesome.
That's why I've got the Sennheisers out. We've got a nice set of ZMF headphones in the office that Zach sent down last week, and they sound incredible, but they don't need any bass boost. The Sennheisers need it to sound respectable.
Well, I actually have, let me pull this over here. This is my, sorry, I'm not prepared. I have way too much stuff on this desk. This is my solution. I'm not sure if I'm holding it up to the computer like you can see that. This is a chameleon, man, focus. A chameleon amplifier. And what this is a, basically these little chips here come out, they're modules, and I have this one designed for the HD600. So this guy, Solder Dude, I forget his full name, he grafts the headphones and then makes compensation circuits to correct the frequency response. So what this does is this takes the bass below, I think it's like 100 hertz on the HD600 and ramps it up, so it gives the sub-bass boost. It also takes some of the little bumpiness in the treble and kind of smooths it out and evens it out. So this gives an HD600 a really, really smooth and refined sound with a nice deep bass. And you can go and you can have them configure this with like AKG headphones or whatever headphones they've measured. So that's kind of what I do, but it sounds like the Element would basically almost eliminate this because I'm primarily using this for the bass. In fact, I don't like the treble EQ because what I think they don't take into effect is your pads wear over time. And when your pads on the HD600 wear, the sound comes a little bit softer, a little bit less treble emphasis. So this takes away the treble edge that you have with new pads. But with the old pads, in my impression, it's just a little bit softer than I'd like. So I kind of wish I had like the bass boost circuit only, which I could probably get for another like $40 or whatever, but yeah, it's not a big deal.
Well, it's a subjective thing too. Not only did the pads change, but what you like in terms of bass or treble is not going to be the same as what someone else likes in terms of bass and treble, even though it's the exact same headphone. So having a parametric or adjustable capability is really valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah, on my Windows machine I use Auto EQ. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, John, but on my website I have like frequency response graphs of earphones. I don't do headphones yet, but I do earphones. And I have the various targets that people like Harman and diffuse field and stuff like that. But I've come up with a target myself, and I always stress this to people. This is not an objective target. It's 100% subjective based on my experience in studios with studio monitor speakers and what I perceive an earphone to have a similar sound to that. So, you might hear that and say, that sounds nothing like a studio monitor. Well, that's okay. This is just my subjective opinion. But what I hope it does is it gives people an idea of, like, if they hear a certain earphone they like and it matches my target well, they get a baseline. And then they can go look at other earphones and know kind of how it varies from that target. But anyway, my point is, I use those frequency response graphs for all the earphones I review, and I make corrections with Auto EQ to kind of create what I consider a corrected earphone. But if you're not familiar with Auto EQ, that's awesome. It's a system-wide EQ for people out there that don't use it for Windows, and it lets you use as many parametric EQ points as you want. You can adjust the width and the value of the decibel increase and basically do exactly what you want in terms of frequency response. The downfall to it is, you're running software on the system, so if you plug in speakers like I have and then headphones, you have to make sure to remember to turn that off, because one of the great features of the Element, at least the old version, I don't know if the new one has this, but I have my speakers plugged into the RCA outputs, and all I have to do is turn this off and it switches between my headphones and goes to the speakers. But what I often do is I forget that I have the Auto EQ on. So I go to the speakers and I'm like, why does that sound weird? And then I realize, oh, my Auto EQ is on, so I've got to make sure I shut that off. But anyway, I'm a huge proponent of EQ, so the addition of that I think is awesome. Do you foresee in the future that you'll add more EQ customization, like 3 or 4 points, and maybe more? Can you adjust the Q value on the Element, or is it a set? I think I saw it was 0.7 on the website or something like that.
Right now it's locked at 0.707,
okay,
which is a pretty common
standard
value. Yeah. It can be modified as a constant variable in firmware. So if you really want a different variable, and shoot. Let me turn that alarm off. If you do want a different variable, all you have to do is have us recompile that Q value and send you a custom firmware.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to put it in the menu. Frankly, we weren't sure that people would care that much about Q. And B, we were running quite low on the number of bits available
Sure.
in the options menu. We had reserved a certain number of bits, literal bits of memory for that OLED screen, and we are out.
Yeah. Well, I'll be the first to admit that I'm one of the extreme users. Like, I love fine-tuning with EQ, so I would love that functionality. But I can see that most people, simplicity is probably better. You know, you're giving them EQ, but it's the ability to say, oh, more bass until they like it, and boom, there you go. And they're not having to worry about, like, where is it, and how do I know that it's good, and how do I know it fits my headphone. It's just kind of the user experience is probably paramount in that situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do not understand most of the options in the products they buy.
Sure.
Even our customers just are like, what is that? And then you've got people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, why haven't you implemented crossfeed and all that? So
Sure.
it's difficult to satisfy everybody without putting the kitchen sink into the product, and we try not to do that because, well, costs would go up pretty quickly. If we did have more bands, then I think you raised the point earlier in the conversation, we probably would have needed more hardware to begin with, and more hardware would mean the price would go up. We really tried to stick with keeping the Element 3 price roughly where it has been. Factoring in inflation and all that, if you look at the price of Element 3 MK2 today at $449, it's actually basically the same price as the original Element was in 2015.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So
one thing that I hear a lot of people ask me about or talk to me about is balanced. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the Element is actually a balanced audio pathway, but it's not a balanced headphone output, right? Is that true?
all right, let me get my soapbox out.
All right, here we go. Now, can I
Balance.
Yeah,
I'm probably vertically limited right now, but
people know me as like I'm not your typical audiophile. Like I'm not into the. I want to word this carefully. I don't want to insult anybody, but I don't. There's a lot of stuff I think is BS, and I'm not saying balance is BS, but I don't think there's an audible difference between a balanced and an unbalanced signal if you have good headphones and a good source. Now, is that your opinion, or do you think that there's a objective benefit to having balanced? Because doesn't it just require twice the power supply design and twice the da-da-da-da-da, and it just complicates your amp like significantly for the probably insignificant advantage of
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at some conversations I've had. Just you're reminding me of people I've talked to about balance, and it's a loaded term. Keep that in mind when you're talking about balance in the audio circle.
Sure. Because when I talk about balance, I'm talking about discrete balanced amplifier channels, not like a balanced microphone cable, which is a completely different thing.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Specifically, what do you want me to talk about in terms of balance? Because again, there's like 10 different connotations here.
So I've heard rumors, and I don't know enough engineering or audio science to back this up, but I've heard rumors that if you were to just design a balanced amplifier, let's say you didn't increase the price, it wasn't anything special, but you just made an amplifier balanced, you can actually increase the like high frequency noise. Do you know anything about that? I don't know if that's just a rumor, but I forget there was an amplifier that sparked that conversation on a certain forum I won't mention, and the conversation kind of went like, oh look, it's this cheap amplifier but it's balanced so it's better, and then some audio objective argumentation guy came along and said, well yeah, but just making it balanced does not make it better, because what you need to do is you need to improve this and that, otherwise you get this high frequency noise or this, I don't know, something else. So I guess the first question I'd say, is there some sonic benefit to simply being balanced, or is that actually bad because it requires a much more complex design to get to the same level of quality thresholds? Does that make sense?
I don't think I have any. I'm looking over at my development desk over here, trying to see if I have anything I can grab and put up in the camera. When you're developing a balanced amplifier, it's very different from when you're developing a balanced digital to analog converter. So most high performance digital to analog converters right now are differential output devices, meaning they have a positive and a negative, or inverting we should call it, non-inverting and inverting pin per channel. So you have 4 total pins for a stereo DAC. And the reason for that is because you can achieve higher performance if you sum the differential signal and cancel out the noise. So that's just how they're designed. And they're current outputs too, not voltage outputs. Now, when you get to the amplifier side, because we're working in an entirely analog domain, and there's so many reasons. Douglas Self wrote an excellent book. I've got this book over to the side. Small Signal Audio Design. Anybody really passionately curious about balance should read Douglas Self's book over there. Yes, if you try to design a balanced amplifier with balanced inputs, meaning you can accept a differential signal, it is actually going to perform worse and have higher noise and distortion than if you were to build a single-ended input amplifier. And to really understand that takes a pretty heavy amount of background knowledge in engineering and circuit design and just general understanding of symmetry. What I have found is that component tolerances, resistor tolerances, and symmetry in an amplifier design are critical. So when you balance currents and voltages and get the exact amount of symmetry in a channel that you are desiring, then the signal tends to come out much cleaner. The problem with a balanced design is that you have to have both the inverting and non-inverting signals going in identically, and you have to handle them identically. And if there's any imperfection in any of the component values or the op amps, or say you're using a discrete circuit, there's certainly going to be a lot more involved. You're going to have slight imperfections in symmetry, or a lack of symmetry, we'll call it. So it's very challenging to create that perfect canceled out signal as you're combining or summing the inverting and non-inverting signals. Putting all that together, if you read through many of these chapters in Douglas Self's books, you'll find that on average you tend to have about 16 chips or more to create a balanced amplifier with 3 dB worse SINAD performance than an equivalent single-ended amplifier. So you've got 16 times the chips, and the performance is still not as good.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. Like, yeah, we can design a good balanced amplifier. It's possible, but the incentives are they're really not there unless you have a reason to use a balanced input. And the reason to use balanced interconnects between a source and an amplifier typically mean you're in a studio environment, or you're in some kind of environment where you've got long cable runs, or there's a lot of EMI and a lot of cables on the floor where noise is going to get picked up.
Absolutely. And for instance, like these are XLR cables for people who aren't familiar with studios, going into my microphone and into my studio monitors. And the benefit of those being long runs, I might have a 20-foot microphone cable, is they have their dedicated ground. There's a 3-conductor cable. And the way it works is, it essentially is the same idea, is that it has a, how would you describe that? It uses that third ground, if I'm not mistaken, to essentially cancel out the noise from the signal, right? Is that kind of basically? So the 3.5 connectors that you see that are unbalanced, I mean, I don't know anyone that uses a 20-foot unbalanced cable. And if you do, okay, but, generally speaking, a 6-foot headphone cable is not really long enough to pick up any kind of induced noise that would interfere with, unless you were maybe, standing next to a MRI machine or something. I have no idea. So yeah, I think it's the idea between noise rejection and sound quality and all these things being better with balanced, I feel like is very unlikely unless you had a very cheap, bad, unbalanced amp and a very nice, well-designed, balanced amp. But then you're not really comparing apples to apples, so it's kind of like, okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only real benefit I could see with a really well-designed balanced amplifier, and maybe I'm wrong, this isn't how it works, but would it potentially give you a better discrete separation in terms of crosstalk? In like the perfect world, theoretically? Or is that not really, is that as
it's
achievable?
that's a debatable thing we could talk about. Look at some of these cables. Let's see here.
Well, one of the specs that I see in a lot of the DAPs that I review and look at is the crosstalk on a lot of them is surprisingly lacking.
Really? Like what?
And when I say lacking, I mean I don't want crosstalk. I want perfect 100% separation between channels. And, usually it's measured in decibels and da-da-da. Well, you'll see, one will have like a 15 decibel wider stereo separation than another DAP. Now, how audible is that? Again, like most things, I don't think it's as audible as people think, because we're not talking 50% difference. We're talking a small percentage of difference when you look at the scale of decibels. But it is better. And if you had a full and completely discrete separation between channels, theoretically, that would be zero crosstalk, right? So is that even possible in an amplifier design, or is that just an unachievable goal?
Well, you could have two monoblock amplifiers. How about that? I know Dan Saggio, is that how you say his name? Look up those. They're like $250,000 amps. You get a pallet of an amplifier when you order that. Yeah, if you had two monoblock amps, you could achieve, theoretically, perfect stereo separation.
And there are some people that argue
Don't ask me to make that.
No. Come on, you don't want to make the element 5?
Yeah, one channel element. Here, sure. Well, yeah, we'll do that.
You just put two elements next to each other. Problem solved. It's
that
simple, right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people, and maybe rightly so, I don't really know, that would argue that you want crosstalk. One of the debates in the audiophile
crossfeed, yeah.
Crossfeed, correct, is that you basically are introducing signal from both channels into each other so that it gives you a more realistic sense of imaging like a speaker would have in a room, because in a speaker in a room you're getting reflections from the acoustic design of the room, and you're not getting discrete channels in your ears. You're getting all sorts of interactions of the waves in the room. So some people argue that having crosstalk or crossfeed added to the signal is actually an improvement in the sound. Now, even if that is the case, I've just always liked the sound of discrete separation because it's just awesome. I mean, it gives you almost a heightened sense of like precision and accuracy at the cost of maybe that frontal speaker-like imaging that you might have with crossfeed. So that's a personal preference.
I tried to soak in that knowledge and understand what other people are thinking about in terms of crosstalk and crossfeed pretty recently, and I came across this long discussion on Audio Science Reviews, like dozens and dozens of pages, and there was no consensus. You had some people who loved crossfeed, and then you had others who liked less crossfeed, like a less aggressive quantity of stereo imaging mix, and then there were those who could not stand crossfeed at all. And another fact that came out of this discussion was that if you are accustomed to listening to headphones, you're more inclined to enjoy stereo separation. Like if you spent decades listening to headphones like we have, then you want stereo separation because this is natural to you. Your brain's wired to hear a left and a right and let let them be separate. But if you're a typical person who listens to not to headphones but to speakers and just the world around them and rarely put headphones on, you really, really want crossfeed because it sounds unnatural to have this stereo separation.
Definitely.
So that's a subjective thing for sure.
Absolutely. I'm actually, so some of my background is a mixing engineer. I've worked in studios and I do a lot of like mastering and mixing, and one of the things that is very common is to not mix too wide. That's like a thing because you have to think of how your mix is going to translate to all the different systems that people are going to be listening to it on. If you go in a car, most people's cars don't have the most phenomenal stereo imaging in the world, and you go to headphones and it's going to be you know what I mean? So you have to kind of account for that. It's also kind of I don't know if I'll say a myth, but it's kind of a common thing you hear that you're not supposed to mix with headphones. And I believe personally that the reason for that is primarily because of the stereo imaging. I mean, you cannot properly gauge, and I love my Sennheisers, but I could mix on these in a pinch and I could do a decent job, but you have to really hear it in a proper speaker sped up in the real world, or you don't really get, like you miss dimensional cues that don't come across in the headphones. Now, with a proper mix on speakers, the headphones can enhance it in a sense and almost make it sound hyper real. But without, analyzing it on the speakers and just mixing the headphones, you can go back to the speakers and it can sound just wrong. It doesn't sound natural at all. So definitely, it's a tool, and you use them both complementing each other, and it works great. But I'm personally kind of the mindset that an amplifier, this is my personal opinion, but I'm going to state it, an amplifier and a DAC should be what I consider transparent. And what I mean by that is they should have zero crossfeed, zero distortion, zero everything as much as possible. And if you want that, you add it after the fact.
Yeah.
Because if I'm, as an engineer, mixing a song to sound an exact way, I will often mix things to half decibel levels, literally. Like, I'll have things in the mix and I'll tweak that, tweak this, do this. And then I'm going to give it to somebody. This is a debated topic too. But the only real way for them to hear what I heard when I mixed it was to have the exact same setup as me in the exact same room with the exact same technology, blah, 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 blah. That's not going to happen realistically. So what do? Well, hopefully you design the equipment to get out of the way and let all of that recording and mixing and that digital, file that I have at the end of the process, let that come through as close to its original form as possible. That's my viewpoint of it. So when people say, oh, like, I love this analog amp that adds distortion and blah, 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 there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's awesome if it gives you enjoyment and it enhances your music. But for me personally, that's altering the musical intent that I had in mind when I recorded the song. So, I'm not saying that someone shouldn't do that to the song I wrote. By all means, if it makes my music sound better to you, that's awesome. But it's not technically the accurate representation of the recording.
Mm-hmm.
So for me personally, something like the Element is great. And I'm not trying to be a JDS marketing lab here, but it's great because I think this thing is objectively transparent. I think it has sufficient specs to get out of the way and let the music shine. And if I want to EQ it, I can do that. If I want to add crossfeed, I can do that. And especially on the new model where it gives you the EQ, that's awesome. So that's kind of my viewpoint. But I understand that some people have a differing opinion, and I won't name any names, but I have another reviewer that we kind of talk about these things a lot, and I think he's a little bit on the other side of the spectrum in the sense that, there's some aspects of what I just said that are hard to prove because, what constitutes a transparent system in the sense that I mixed on a certain set of speakers or a certain set of headphones in a certain environment, and you're not going to get that with somebody else. So how do you know that it sounds like what I intended it to sound like? It's not going to. Do you know what I mean? So there's that element of randomness in everybody's setup. But my intent is that with agreed upon standards, you have a baseline. So I think that's a lot easier to do with speakers, unfortunately, than headphones, right? Because in speakers, you can record them in an anechoic chamber, and you can get a certain flat frequency response, and you have a more measurable objective reality, I'd call it. Whereas with headphones, there's a lot more subjectivity. People can't agree on how much bass is required for it to sound like a speaker, or where the pin gain is supposed to be, or this or that. And you have Sean Olive, and you have Etymotic, and all these different targets, and it's not like the same as speakers. Speakers are fairly, not perfectly, but fairly agreed upon. There are objective standards for like studios and recording artists and things like that. So if you know those things, and what a lot of musicians will do is they'll treat their studio to obtain that flat response and those certain, kind of like the amp, you're kind of going towards this objective goal of getting the acoustics to be a certain reference way, then it doesn't really matter what people listen to it on, because they're going to hear that music, relatively speaking, the same way they hear all of their music. You know what I mean? So if every, and this doesn't happen, of course, but if every recording artist had the objective great studio setup and recorded all their music, your rap artist who has a super bassy song and your acoustic artist who has a nice clean acoustic sound, those are going to sound relatively the same to the person listening to them on their system because they came from the same objective baseline. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's my goal as a musician, is to kind of achieve as much of a neutral studio environment, which again is not as easy as it sounds, and then play that back on as objectively neutral of a playback system as possible. So I think it's awesome what you guys have done, because you're basically giving us the ability, us being musicians, listeners, to hear objectively transparent music at an affordable price point, which is honestly astonishing. I don't remember what I paid for that Atom DAC and that amp, but that was like nothing. I mean, $99 I think, or something like that.
Yeah,
And
nothing.
and I mean,
For free, we're just giving them away. No.
but for my personal opinion, I would say, given the typical IEM that most people would listen to, you're not going to hear a difference between the Element and the Atom. That's just my personal opinion. That's nothing against the Element, which is technically probably a superior device.
Well, the first generation Element. Let's be clear about that.
First generation. What do you mean? Like the new Elements sound better?
It does.
So you think you can hear an audible difference between with a standard pair of earphones, like I don't know, a model that like an Etymotic, like say you have an Etymotic ER4S, and you plug
Especially,
and you plug that into the Element 3 without any DSP modifications, and you plugged it into the Atom. You think the Element 3 is going to be noticeably better?
Yeah.
Really? Interesting.
And it's really obvious when you get down to it. It's the potentiometer or lack thereof.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
any of these analog amps, the $99 amplifiers rely on analog potentiometers, okay? And the channel balance in a potentiometer, even the best, is not that good.
Sure.
So you've got this slight discrepancy in soundstage that should not
And I
be
hear
present.
that on my Element at low volumes.
Yeah.
So I always make sure that I have it at least a quarter, to get rid of that. But despite the channel balance and the potentiometer, specification-wise, do you think...
It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's
not
an impressive
terrible.
amplifier.
But when you go from that really slight discrepancy, maybe
To
it's
digital.
0.1 dB off
Sure.
in the analog domain, and you go to the new generation Element 3, which has perfect channel balance because there is no analog potentiometer, the soundstage is perfect. You are centered every time, no matter what volume you're at.
Definitely.
And the difference, I don't think people who have upgraded really understand or appreciate why it sounds different, but that's why. It's
Sure.
because the soundstage is now flawless.
Gotcha. Now, how much volume do you think the Element 1 takes to reach that level of channel balance, or can it never reach that level of channel balance?
You have to be at 100% to get perfect channel balance.
Really? Interesting.
If you're not at 100%, there's always going to be a slight amount of random imbalance.
Sure.
Um,
Well, it's just an analog circuit, though, or an
Yeah,
analog
yeah.
component, because a potentiometer is just a resistor, right? Essentially,
it's a circular resistor, we'll call it. Yeah.
a metal wound resistor or something like that.
Well, a potentiometer is a track with a slider on it, or a wiper they call it.
Yep.
And that wiper is going across a resistive
It's a
track.
variable resistor.
Yeah. So two resistors in series.
Sure,
And the
'cause
wiper
each
is changing the point at which the resistance divider occurs.
Yep. And that's why, because you have voltages going across those, and it's impossible to make them exact.
Yeah. But to put some numbers into perspective there, I think it was around minus 40 dB that the original Element began to have decent channel balance from the fully counterclockwise position. So you're probably at like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and then it's okay. That's about minus 40 dB.
That makes
full
sense,
scale.
because I usually use it around 12 o'clock, because what I do is I turn it up and turn down my system volume to get to that point at which I know the Element is balanced enough for me, and then I use my
Enough,
computer
yeah.
to adjust the volume.
Yeah,
That's
and it's
kinda
probably
what I
pretty
do.
good at that point. One of the other observations I've made recently, looking at the 27 millimeter potentiometers from Alps in a ZMF amplifier, not to dismiss the quality here, but even with that really high-end, expensive potentiometer, often regarded as like the go-to best potentiometer you can get in terms of potentiometers before crossing into some other technology, channel balance is not perfect.
Yeah.
You still see the same kind of imbalance that we see from our hand-matched pots and the $99 Atoms that you see on a 27 millimeter Alps pot. And I'm like, well, what's the point, guys? So
Yeah. I mean, that's just analog to digital domain, right? You're just never going to match that digital perfection.
right.
Yeah, and that's awesome. So, with the design of the Element switching to digital, was that a cost limitation initially, or was it just a progression of the design over time?
It was a progression of the design. We wanted to actually make the thing sound better. We wanted to push the boundary of what could be achieved in this form factor, in this package. And we put years, like multiple years of prototypes between element 2 and element 3, and realized after all of those boxes and boxes of prototypes that the potentiometer had to go. It was the limiting factor. It was the bottleneck in the design.
Sure.
And once you take that out, a lot of options opened up and the sound actually improved.
So, speaking of the potentiometer, we're
Yeah.
gonna get a little kinky here. One of the things that everyone loves about this thing is this knob.
That's a great knob.
I love this knob, and supposedly this ain't even the best knob. You've made improvements to this, so I think you've dampened it or made it firmer.
We put a lot of time into that too.
I like this knob. I'm not gonna lie.
It's the new one. We initially described as being more firm. We've relaxed it a little bit based on the first few weeks of customer feedback. Some people thought, "Oh, that's pretty firm." I said, "Okay, well, no problem. We've got other mechanical options here." So we changed to a custom spring and made it a little less firm. So now it feels closer to the original element, but still a little bit different. It's not the same physical feel, but it has turned out really nice, and the feedback has been phenomenal.
Now, I saw in the manual, did it say that you could adjust the sensitivity or the rate at which it adjusts the gain?
Yeah.
was I reading
Well,
that
there's several options in there, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to. There's a speed between switching from low to high gain.
Which is now automatic. So on mine, there's a button you
Automatic.
push on the back,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is okay. But I mean, obviously, it's a lot nicer to just turn the volume up and it does it for you. But can you change? I guess my question is, can you change the rate at which the volume increases when you spin the knob, like the fineness of that control?
There are two steps. So it's a quadrature encoder. For those of you not familiar with that term, it's basically looking at encoder pulses and determining that you are either going clockwise or counterclockwise based on.
Is that just
Some
LEDs or
logic.
like infrared? Like what is that? How does it detect that?
Well, encoders could be any digital input that sees a circular path, we'll call it.
Sure.
And the encoding can be done in any number of ways. You could do it optically. You could do it with magnetism. There, plenty of options. But we're doing it in Element 3 with a custom optical encoder. So we've got two optical sensors. One senses basically an out of phase from the other sensor, so that you can determine when you're going clockwise or counterclockwise. Any other questions on that?
So
Did
well,
I
you were
explain
gonna
it clearly enough?
you were gonna talk about what settings there were in terms of adjustment sensitivity.
Right. Yeah. There's a single setting, so you cannot really make it faster or slower because you're limited by the number of, I'm going to call it fins or pulses in the encoder itself as designed. But you can change essentially to go slower. So instead of going full speed, you can go half speed.
So you're just cutting in half the values that it's reading, and just
Yeah.
That's cool. That's actually because it would basically make you change the volume quicker, essentially. So if it's too sensitive and you don't want to have to spin so much, you can kind of cut it in half and make it twice the speed. Or is it the other
By
way
default,
around?
it's actually full speed, so you can
Okay.
make
So
it
you're
slower.
going the other way
right?
around. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's
Can
cool.
make
Though.
it
How many
more
values?
sensitive.
How many volume steps are there?
255.
Holy crap, that's a lot of steps.
That is a lot of steps.
Wow, that's some fine control.
Oh yeah.
That's awesome. So, I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a weird question, but say money was no object. Like, whatever you could do engineering-wise, do you have like a dream product that you've always wanted to build?
No, and that's actually a huge problem. I frustrated a lot of our staff over time because of that. And I don't want to brag here, but money is no object at this point in my career. So we're really happy with what we've developed, and we build what we want to build here. And that's actually a pretty big problem because a lot of the movement in the audio industry right now is towards building more premium, more luxurious products. And if you go to a Can Jam, you'll see amplifiers that cost $30,000, $50,000 or more. And I can't tell you that they sound any better. They look nicer. They'll have salesmen there talking about all the things they did in terms of engineering, and they'll show the circuit boards and talk about their oscillators and their custom discrete topologies and all that. But when you get down to it, sit down with the headphones and listen and close your eyes, and it doesn't sound any different. Maybe I'm biased. I could be completely biased, but I am super happy with what I've done in Element 3. That is currently the best product that I could build to my ears. What I do want to do, I'm not done yet developing amplifiers and DACs. There are a few features that are more esoteric in a way and solve a couple minor problems, like galvanic isolation for USB. That's something that I would really like to see done more. We have not really pursued it because it didn't really fit into the cost or the budget of many of our projects. But that's something that can be added. We've been working more on improving the mechanical experience, certainly improving channel balance. But there was this arms race for performance that has ended, in my opinion. I don't think power needs to advance anymore. For a while, people were like, oh, you should build a 5-watt amplifier, 10-watt amplifier. I'm like, but I don't turn my element up to high gain. Why do I need more than 2 watts? Like,
I can honestly say there's only been a very rare set of exceptions that I've ever used the high gain knob, and I use the 600s on my element. I don't listen to them at that volume. So for me personally, I'm with you. Like, I think the power of the element is more than sufficient, which is good too, because it's nice to know that it has that headroom and to know that you're never going to be wanting for power. But like, there's no reason to really go any further, in my opinion. And
yeah,
channel balance aside, I've done double blind listening tests, not double blind, kind of blind and a half. Like I said with my switch that I do there, where I kind of confuse things and like kind of just switch back and forth and test myself without looking. And I'll be the first to admit, I can't tell a difference between the element and, my Sony A105 at the appropriate volumes where the channel balances match pretty well and that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying there's no differences, but like just sonically, the general impression you get listening to the music, I don't switch to it and think, oh, that sounds so much better. I mean, it's a hard thing to tell, and not to boast myself, but I mean, Super Review and I have done a couple videos where he sends me earphones and I blindfold myself and listen to them, and I can detect what drivers an earphone has, which some people probably wouldn't even believe that, but I mean, you can go watch the videos and I can say that's a balanced armature, that's a dynamic driver, because they have characteristics to them. I think the difference between the amps in these is less than that. So I think my point isn't that there's no improvement going out and getting an element, especially depending on the headphones you have. My point is just that people oftentimes will say, oh, wow, there's such a big difference, such a big difference, such a big difference. And it's like, your difference is going to be much greater by buying a different headphone. Like, hands down.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. Like, if you want to hear remarkable change or get something to sound different, go for different headphones. Changing from your $99 Atom amp might sound slightly better going to an Element 3, but beyond that level, you don't need to spend more money. It's not going to be a better experience.
Sure. And of course, you get the biggest difference, in my view, from the Element 1 to the 3, just for me personally, what entices me to get it, is the user experience.
Yeah.
I really like the OLED, the EQ, the fact that it has Osteo drivers supported, and just all that stuff. That's great. That's awesome that you did that. So, in terms of the, we were talking about the design, Dream Design.
Dream Design, yeah.
Looking
Dream
at
Design.
other headphone amps, so you kind of talked about it a little bit. You think that $30,000 amps like essentially sound the same. Are there any differences out there that you wish you could? Let me put it this way: is there any improvement that you think that you could make that you haven't made, that maybe some other expensive amp is doing, or that maybe no amp is doing because of technical limitations or price limitations or size limitation? I mean, are you content with where you're at completely, or do you feel like there's still
No, there's still room for improvement. Like, I'm not going to unveil the full roadmap or things that are in development that I'm not supposed to talk about.
Sure.
Yeah, we're still moving forward. We still have changes to make. You raised a strikingly related note to Seth Godin's blog post this morning on raising the bar or improving the average. So basically what he was saying this morning was sometimes in a market like McDonald's comes out and suddenly they've raised the bar of what it means to be, fast and efficient and low cost for fast food. And that put a lot of smaller restaurants out of business when it happened because suddenly the average had shifted. And I think that's very much where we're at in the audio industry for amplifiers. We've gotten so good, there's not going to be any more raising of the bars. You're just going to slightly bump the average quality in minor ways. And it's not going to be as exciting as it was 10 or 15 years ago anymore. No, so there's nothing that I'm really looking at like, man, I wish I had that because I've been doing this for 15 plus years and I would have done it by now. There's just a handful of things that we're really curious about improving, and most of it's in the digital domain by this point.
Well, I can tell you the product that I would love to see you make.
Tell me.
Well, I've told you in the past in emails. You probably remember this. I want a dedicated portable EQ unit, which is something you can plug into any phone, very small, very compact. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but there's a company that makes something similar, a Codecs, 5K, I think it's called. Something
5K,
along that line, but a JDS version. That would be freaking awesome. It doesn't.
I love that thing. Looking at it, I don't own one. I haven't bought one, but
I don't either. But I have a friend who has one, and he swears by it.
So that actually utilizes the engine for the Bluetooth feature. So there's a chip in there from Qualcomm running the Bluetooth powerhouse, we'll call it, and that happens to have equalization built in. So because that company happened to be one of the lead developers working with Sony and had access to all of the chips from Qualcomm and the Sony technology, they were able to create their own code with an equalizer and build their own app. So they did a fantastic job, by the way. It's got a cult following, and yeah, I like that concept. That's a great idea. We're not really in the portable scene, and
Sure.
I'm curious if there is some kind of overlap for other people like you and I where we would like to have more equalization options. So I will say that we're exploring the concept. I'll put it that way.
So Codecs, I had that idea way before you.
Yeah.
I think I emailed you that like 10 years ago. I was like, hey, John, you need to do this.
Well, yeah. 10 years ago, everything was a little bit less advanced.
Sure,
so.
definitely. Yeah, because as I said, like, with the measurements I do and the EQ tweaking I do, something like a Codecs would let me, I'm not positive, I think the Codecs actually lets you take those auto EQ files or something like that and like sync it.
Import it.
Yeah, and
Import it,
that's
yeah,
like awesome. That's cool.
So have you, I don't think we actually talked about auto EQ.
A little
people
bit.
know what auto EQ is. I know what it is, but
Yeah, that's what I use. We talked a little bit earlier. That's kind of what I use on my Windows system.
I thought maybe I'm thinking of something else. There was this new app developed. I thought it was auto EQ. Like autoeq.app was the website address. What happens if you go there? Equalizer APO was one of the system-wide EQs. Anyway, there's a new app out. You go to this website, you can,
APO,
on the fly, enter a target or Harman target or any target you want. You can pick headphones, and it'll make the headphones equalize to that target.
Yeah, we have that on our graph websites. So, if
Gotcha.
you, I don't have it implemented yet, although I could do it tonight if I spent the time and not be lazy. But like Super Review has it over on his, and if you go to his graphing tool, you can pick the Harman or whatever, and you can pick the target and then the headphone you want, and you can say auto EQ, and it will equalize them and give you the resulting auto EQ file that you can put right in Equalizer APO, and boom, it equalizes.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So we're talking about the same thing.
Yep.
Good. Yeah, I love that technology. That's a great idea. The thing to be wary of, Zach had mentioned this to me, and I really respected his take on it, was that you cannot trust all of the measurements out there. One of his high-end headphones, for instance, was just absolutely destroyed in terms of demand a couple years ago because a certain so-called reviewer measured it with a set of ears, we'll call it, and it was not a valid measurement in Zach's opinion. But because of the measurements published on the internet, suddenly that headphone was no longer regarded as hi-fi, and it was frustrating to him because it was completely inaccurate. It was not a valid measurement.
Sure.
But a lot of these EQ measurements for headphones are done by random people.
Amateurs.
Not necessarily random, but amateurs. Yeah.
Sure.
And they may have a big following. They may no longer look like an amateur, but the reliability of the information is critical. You got to trust the information.
I'm a complete amateur. But I tell people up front how I measure, what to expect, and what not to. So for instance, one of the things that a lot of people do, and there's debates over this, but when you insert an earphone, because I do earphones specifically, into a coupler, you get a resonant frequency at around 10 kilohertz typically, and that can shift depending on the depth of the earphone. Well, depending on that resonance peak, that can drastically change the appearance of the treble of an earphone. So you could have an earphone that you put on one coupler and one on another and say, well, that one has a lot better treble. It's like, no, it doesn't. He just had it in a millimeter deeper. So one of the things I always tell people with the measurement sites is you can't compare other measurement sites. They're not consistent with each other. Now, they're all useful, and if you understand how that person does their measurements, it's great to use their own system to compare things that they've measured. But there's a lot to learn and a lot to know about that. I don't think people should go into measurements blind and just assume because it matches the line on the target is great. In fact, one of the things that I keep mentioning Super Review and I, but we work a lot together with these measurement things and we talk a lot about it. We always talk about something we call technicalities, which is just a very vague word, but essentially I've heard a lot of earphones and I've measured them and I've equalized them to match my preference target, knowing the imperfections and the oddities. But what I can guarantee you is that even with the same frequency response, they do not all sound the same. So is that because the measurement's wrong? Is it because there's different driver tech? Is it because there's this, that? There's a lot of variables. So I think that someone just going in and saying, okay, well that matches that target, that's dangerous. But if you know someone, like a reviewer that you read and listen to, and you say, okay, I agree with their perception of sound, and I agree with their perceived target, so you can then look at the earphones and say, well, how do they compare in that person's own target? That's a little different, but we actually just had a project on a forum I won't mention, and we sent around a couple specific earphones. One of them was an ER2 SE from Automotive, and a Blonde VO5, and a couple different ones, and we all measured them like a bunch of different people on this tour, and we basically compared our rigs, and I lucked out because my measurements actually were almost identical to the $50,000 BK coupler rig. So I have a pretty good knockoff Chinese coupler, but basically we were able to see everyone's measurements, and if you go and you look at that site, you'll see they don't look the same. I mean, they're some have drastically different pinna and bass response, and so yeah, that's something to. It's not something to take lightly. I think you need to kind of be really into that and know what you're getting into to use it in a valid way. I think it's dangerous for amateurs that don't know anything about it to just jump in and think, okay, this guy says this is great, it matches his target, that's got to be awesome. It's like, no. And everybody's ears are different. Your ears aren't going to be the same as a coupler. You might measure one way and you might hear it a different way.
Well, the issue I think that Zach was referring to is that while you and I may have that understanding,
sure,
some people take the information they see on the internet blindly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's dangerous.
So it's a problem.
Definitely.
But that's a whole separate discussion. But that's the direction a lot of the internet has gone in recent years. It's always been a problem, but it's becoming more of a problem lately, where one person can really change the direction of any product through a single post or a single video,
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. It's like a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's awesome to have so much information out there for someone to research and learn, but at the same time, like you said, it can change the landscape and sometimes drastically affect perception of things. And so, for instance, I don't know if this ever happened to you or not specifically, but in the early days of JDS Labs, I was a huge fan because I was looking for objectively good measuring equipment at an affordable price. And a lot of the people on the forums that I were part of hated anyone who talked about objective anything. And it's
there's still a group like that.
Oh my gosh, you can't even say the word objective without someone freaking out. And it's I'm not talking about people that are like us who say you got to be careful about what you say is objective because some of it's actually subjective. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who think you shouldn't go for objective perfection. You should just subjectively go for what you like, period. Or there's no way to know at all. And it's that was Did that affect you in the starting up of your company? I mean, did you have to fight that?
No, I ignored it. I just did my own thing. I mean, if I read every comment on the internet and read all of the haters, because there are some that just
Sure.
absolutely hate the approach of objectivity, then we would not have succeeded. But for the first 10 years, I was really not paying attention to what anybody said. I was doing my own thing.
Focused.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good way to do it. Just stay on track, move ahead, and then you look back and you say, "Wow, look at all that stuff I accomplished." So,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
We're coming up. One of my goals before I retire is to at least hit a certain number of orders, and we're getting actually pretty close to that. I'm not going to retire, but um, it's pretty cool to think about just the sheer volume of impact we've had in terms of number of people helped to enjoy headphones, and it blows my mind, really. It's been more successful than I ever would have imagined.
and I'm sure it's rewarding just to know that you've had that effect on people.
In a way, yeah. Running a company's never a straightforward thing. It's never easy. There's a lot of challenges, both challenges and successes along the way. But looking back, yeah, it's been phenomenal.
It just must feel good though to know that people are listening to your products and enjoying them.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. I think there's 40,000 Atom Amp owners or something like that.
Wow, that's
It's just a stadium full of people. Think about it that way.
yeah, that's awesome. Well, in lieu of not going too long, did you want to take a few minutes here and look at some of the questions that people have in the chat, and I can read them? And
Yeah, where are those at?
if
Oh,
you go
there's
to
a chat?
yeah, if you go to the actual YouTube link I put in the Discord, you'll see the live chat on the right. I can read them to
Gotcha.
you if that's easier.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Let's see what we got here. So everyone loves the knob, love the firm knob. Q-Dog says whack. Let's see. Okay, so Super Review wanted to know about power output benefit from balanced, assuming the battery power of a mobile product. He understands that balanced lets you get double the output power for the same voltage, and perhaps voltage is fixed or limited by the battery. I don't know if that make any sense to you? Are you
I'm not sure about the battery. That in a battery-powered amplifier, maybe I'm misinterpreting, so feel free to ask again. You're still going to have to define the voltage rails going into the amplifier, so you're going to be bottlenecked most likely by that battery voltage, or however it is boosted or compensated. So while the balanced signal is going to typically be stronger than an unbalanced signal by a factor of 2, it doesn't always mean that you're going to get twice the amount of power. You're
Sure.
still limited by however the amplifier is designed.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question, Mark. If not, let me know. And then we have someone mentioning here, when are you going to have a resin knob on the Element? I like
A resin knob.
Dude.
You know, that question has popped up. I need to talk with one of our suppliers, because when I looked into how to do that, it's possible to do in-house, but very messy. I wonder how many people would like to see the resin. I know it's like 3 or 4 that have asked about it. And typically when we do something, we want to have a few
More than
more
that.
than 3 or 4 people
Sure.
involved.
Excuse me. Element 3 doesn't have balanced XLR speaker outputs. No, it does not, right? It has, is it RCA outputs?
Correct. The outputs are RCA.
Now, did you change the Element 3 to have, are there no RCA inputs any longer?
Correct. It is a completely digital design.
So it's SPDIF, I assume?
Optical, yeah, SPDIF and USB.
Awesome. All right. Sorry, the text on this is tiny. My iPad. Is there a link to the study? Which study, Ace, are you talking about? The codecs thing isn't out. No flip them out. Can you explain the second harmonic stuff with the Element? I think you kind of talked about that a little bit. So basically, in your development, you were
Yeah.
trying to push the harmonics, and you kind of left that in there.
Correct. Yeah, we talked about that. It's essentially a function built into the ESS chip that allows you to mathematically compensate for the harmonics.
Someone asked if you could compare your products to the, I'll call it Scheidt amplifiers, if you're familiar with that brand, SCHIIT.
Well, that's a pretty
vague.
wide question.
Yeah, I know. All right, let's see.
In what way?
Is there a more specific question there, Ace? Let's see. He said, curious if they're interested, what their competitors, specifically Scheidt. Find it surprising that so many people still go to them, even though JDS, in his opinion, has better build and designs. Maybe the UX is way better. And what their thoughts are on source memes. Do they have a stance on all the different DAC chips and amp chips and all that other stuff that people claim make a difference? And kind of talked about that a little bit, I guess. Like, do you have a stance on, people saying, oh, this DAC is better and that amp is better? I mean, obviously, from what we're talking about, it sounds like, a lot of it is just, I don't want to say placebo, but, insignificant differences, I'd call it.
Today, where we have
beyond the threshold of mattering, I would say.
Yeah. Most of the DACs out there should not sound remarkably different. There are some really, really minor differences in the low frequency performance, especially if you change the filters on an ESS or DAC. You might notice a different feel if you have a subwoofer connected to a DAC, because you have those low frequencies that you're not going to hear through a set of headphones, but you could feel them from a sub.
Sure.
But no, in general, you really should not hear a remarkable difference between a modern DAC and another DAC of similar design.
Mark says you should go to his Squiglink page and play with the EQ settings, that auto EQ that we talked about.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the new JDS ZMF amp collab?
I hope it is done soon. Right now, we are trying to. Well, I'm not doing any work on it right now. I'm waiting to see what happens from the machine shop. It's out of my hands at this point, but basically, the amplifier is electrically done. It has been done. We presented it at CanJam Chicago. We had a lot of traffic go through the ZMF room. And it's a 2-watt amp, very similar in nature to the ELAMP 2 Plus balanced, where you have a nice quad input balanced to single-ended converter to accept XLR input, and then it's converted to essentially single-ended output through XLR and 4.4 millimeter jacks. So they're not balanced headphone outputs, but the balanced headphone output is one of those loaded terms that is very rarely understood correctly. It has XLR and 4.4 out. It's not a differential output amplifier. I'll put it that way. Hope that is enough of a synopsis of what the ZMF amp is about.
And someone asked, do you have an in-house machine shop?
The machine shop, is next door these days. I helped found the machine shop back in 2014, 2015. My brother-in-law really was passionate about machining. I never was. It was a noisy thing, and headphones are not really conducive to noise in the room. So we, for a while, had a separate building down the road. That was a nightmare, having two separate facilities, trying to get parts back and forth and coordinate. So we bought a building in 2015, spent $500,000 or more that year on the machine shop, and now we have a big wall separating the two companies. I have divested my ownership of the shop. This year will hopefully be the last year I have any involvement with that, financially speaking. And it'll be fully taken over by Nick Amazich. He's done a remarkable job. He's got robots in there running the machines, so they can run elements and knobs and not even be in the building these days. It's incredible what they do.
Robots. Before you know it, it'll be AI. So, kind of another side question related to that. So I assume back in the day, like 20 years ago, you probably were ordering parts from Mauser.com or something like that. How has that shifted from like 20 years ago to now? Like supplying and obtaining parts. Is it the same exact process? Do you have, obviously I assume you have different agreements with different suppliers than you did back then. But how has that changed for you?
Well, we've expanded our supplier network. I bought from Mouser today, but a lot of the things that I buy now in small orders are for prototyping purposes. If we're going to do a production run, that's planned 2 years in advance.
Sure.
So most of the time, with COVID, it became a nightmare, but purchasing and planning for larger projects is now done by looking at all the components we're using across all the major products and deciding how many total components we need that will go into all of those projects. So we're buying just capacitors in large volumes and just diodes. Like I've got 250,000 something diodes on the shelf over there. And we buy enough ICs to last for a year or two. And we've got capacitors that'll get us through the next year. This is not something I had to do until COVID hit, by the way. So we have way more component level inventory than historically. The prices are not great anymore. Even though you do these bigger deals and say, okay, I'll commit to 2 years supply of diodes, you don't get a big price break. I'd love to say I did, but I don't. I get the opportunity to have the inventory. That's the advantage.
Someone also asked, who does the plastic injection molding for the atom amps?
That is a well-kept secret. Originally, it was through a middleman in California. We were paying a company called Fictive, and had I been more inquisitive to understand who was actually in charge of that sooner, we would have saved a shocking amount of money. I think it was about $200,000.
Wow.
But yeah, what's done is done.
Yep, you learn and you move on.
Yeah. Yep, that relationship's been over for about a year. Anyway, we're phasing out the plastic. I'm not sure how long we're going to keep the plastic chassis. We did introduce the heavy editions of Atom Amp and DAC pretty recently, which have a really nice metal top and metal knob, and it feels better. And we plan to continue iterating the enclosure quality.
Cool. Now, speaking of enclosures, obviously I had my fancy moon design here, and then I think on my, what did I have there? A little Alan Parsons project thing on my C5. Do you guys still do that kind of like custom engraving, or is that a limited thing for certain models?
Yeah, we've actually expanded that with the heavy atoms because you could not engrave onto plastic. Now that we have metal aluminum tops again, you can engrave onto the atom line. You can still engrave onto the element line, and we didn't really promote much of those changes, but last year we retired some of our legacy laser engraving machines and upgraded to a galvanic type of fiber laser. So we have 2 fiber lasers in the main shop and 1 large CO2 laser in our dock for cutting acrylic parts for various projects. But the fiber lasers are fantastic because they're very, very fast and they are very precise. So with the previous laser engravers, we spent a lot of time trying to get things perfectly aligned and centered, and it was a challenge to get the icons to land where they needed to be. It's no longer an issue. Everything's spot on every time we do it. So
Nice.
Yeah, we're happy to engrave custom artwork.
Awesome. And do you send like a template file and someone can just modify a design to that template? Or like if you wanted to put something on the element, how do you know? Like,
I know where it will go.
Yeah.
You really don't. There's a
you
system.
just want to tweak it.
It's a pretty basic system, and there's a blog post you'll find linked in the shopping cart. If you go to the shopping cart, you'll see engrave if you have an eligible item in there, like element. You click on engrave, and it'll guide you through what you can engrave and what is not acceptable, like full color, detailed artwork tends to not work out so well. Monochrome and black and white works very well. There's a link to a blog post of suitability there. There's links to templates, so you can basically go into Adobe or whatever preferred software and put the files onto mock-up enclosure and submit it that way. But the easiest thing to do is just drag and drop an image, and we'll center it onto the knob.
artistic discretion.
Yeah.
So, to kind of wrap things up here, I got a question for you. What is your favorite headphone?
Favorite headphone? Probably the one on my head at this point, honestly.
650.
I really enjoy the ZMF Verite that we just received. That one's fantastic. But I don't think I have a favorite headphone anymore. I've tried Focal Clears for a while. I thought I liked the Odyssey LCD XCs, and I put those on last week, and I don't like them anymore. So,
Interesting.
yeah, I don't know if my ears changed or,
But the
or
650
what.
is just, you can always go back to it. It's relaxing, but it still sounds great. It's good set.
Well, the key to the 600s and 650s is that I can wear them for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and my
Absolutely.
head doesn't hurt after I take them off.
They're super comfortable.
And I can't say that about any of the really large headphones.
Definitely. I'm personally more towards the 600 in terms of frequency response, but they're both very, very similar. The 600 is a little bit warmer, although that's a debate you can get into with depending on what generation you have and what your pads are and blah, 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 blah. But they're both awesome. The Sennheiser HD series is great. Even the 598 are great. Do you ever use any earphones, or are you strictly a headphone guy?
I'm just a headphone guy these days. I used to have earbuds and all that, but I don't have a need anymore. I either sit here at this desk or I sit at my desk at home, and if I'm
Yep.
not at a desk, I'm not wearing headphones anymore.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
just a point in my life right now.
Makes sense. Well, it's past 11:30, so
Yeah.
it's probably a
Yeah.
good time to wrap it up. And I really appreciate you coming on the channel. It's awesome to have you here and to geek out and answer some questions that only geeky audio people would probably have any idea what we're talking about. But so thanks for coming. Is there anything you want to say? Anything as you sign off here?
Really appreciate the opportunity. It's good speaking with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John. And looks like all the questions. 598 slaps, he said. So thanks again, and have a good night. And I'll talk to you some other time, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right. Bye, John. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in tonight. That was John, and he's an awesome guy. And if you're not familiar with him, watch the video, check out his products. But as always, thank you guys for joining me. If you have any other questions, leave them down below, and this live stream will be available soon as a permanent video you can go back and watch. But thanks, you guys. I'll catch you later.